I might remind the viewer that this is the third video in the series on Eccles Hill. If you've not seen the previous two, I might recommend you do so, as they contain valuable background and details that will lend clarity and understanding to this one.
By late morning on the 25th, what preparations could be done had taken place, and gathering his men, O'Neill led his Fenian supporters in a column headed straight for a small bridge over the Chickabiddy Creek, which effectively marked the border. On the other side lay the aspirations and dreams of the whole Fenian movement. The Battle of Eccles Hill had begun.
Emerging from the valley in the shadow of Minister Hill, a column of green-clad men, weapons on their shoulders, slowly made their way towards Rickard's farm. Along with them were dozens of curious onlookers, civilians from Franklin and the surrounding area. So confident of success and so naive of the dangers of battle were they, that men, women, and children had come as spectators. They mounted the many piles of lumber at Rickard's farm and sat as if at a sporting event. It would seem as though they expected the Canadians to simply run in the face of the attack, and indeed they might have been happy, if somewhat mistaken, as the men of the Missisquoi Home Guard ran from any open ground that they may have found themselves in at that moment, and disappeared into the rocks and trees of their fighting positions. The red sashes were standing too. The Fenians rounded the bend and descended on Rickard's farm. From there, a group split off and headed for the bridge over the Chickabiddy. This was the Fenian advance guard. As it happened, another group moved off to the west and took positions on Rickard's Hill. It would appear that these men reinforced the Fenian picket, already located there. Now, it's a bit unclear if the whole Fenian main body took to the hill, or just a portion thereof. Chances are, the 300 or so men so formed probably divided themselves in those two locations. Canadian mouths must have been dry as Captain Cronin's advance guard neared the border. Discipline was evident, as not a shot was fired whilst the Fenians were still on the American side. The Fenian advance guard halted briefly at Rickard's farm. There they loaded their recently issued weapons. The Needham was a rather clumsy conversion to breechloader, and no doubt this was the first time that any of the Fenian ranks had ever done so. As the Fenian advance guard completed their final preparations, the main body tramped up the road behind them. It is unclear just how organized the Fenians were, but suffice it to say, as the advance guard crossed the start line, the main body and the Fenian leadership were taking up positions at Rickard's farm. Just how extensive the deployment was is lost to time. Perhaps, as it was quite plainly clear that O'Neill anticipated an easy entry into Canada, there was not much in the way of tactical maneuvering. Over at the Holden's farm, Asa Westover and Andrew Tonique were busy discussing messing arrangements for their men, and Lieutenant Baker and 16 of his men from the 60th Battalion were already there, partaking in the hospitality. Suddenly, rolling across the quiet farmland came the unmistakable sound of the crash of musketry. Immediately, all concerned dropped their meals, picked up their arms, and hurriedly departed for Eccles Hill.
There were only about 40 members of the Home Guard at Eccles Hill, and at the time of the battle, there were only a little over 25 members that were there on duty. The rest of them had gone back to have lunch. They'd been waiting all night, and most of the morning they thought the Fenians weren't going to come. They expected them the day before. They didn't come, and then they sort of figured, well, they're not going to come today. It's getting too late. But then the Fenians did come across the border, so they were met by only about 25 red sashes and about 20 militia that were spread out on the hillside.
There. The 20 or so men of the red sashes and the 20 or so men of the 60th who were still on the position watched as the Fenian advance guard approached the bridge.
Where are they?
A voice cried out clear across the countryside as they began to move across the border.
Double quick!
And the Fenians began to run. Still, the Canadians waited. The footfalls of the Fenians on the bridge had hardly ceased as they tramped by the leather tannery on the stream bank, when the order to fire was given. Just as the last Fenian entered Canada, the command was given, and the moment that had been anticipated had come.
Commence!
It is unclear just exactly how the fire first was delivered. One might assume that due to the extended order nature of the position, that independent firing was immediately used, rather than measured volleys. Regardless, there was indeed an opening crash, as all along the line, formed in its lazy L, puffs of white smoke appeared all along its length. The effect was decisive. In the first fusillade, Fenian John Rowe was struck and killed, exposed to fire from their front and their left. The Fenians, who had not deployed into any kind of fighting formation, broke and scattered, mostly to their right, to take shelter amongst the buildings and structures of the Eccles farm.
When the Fenians crossed the border in column, it must have presented the most beautiful target you ever saw if you were a soldier. I mean, 50 or 100 or, whatever number of men it may have exactly been, crossing in perfect column, and you're 150 to 200 yards away, firing into their flanks with absolutely no trees obstructing your view whatsoever, no fences.
Or the fact that those red sashes were up there and they knew how to shoot. They'd been training for the last at least 3.5 years, getting ready for the next Fenian incursion, and they were marking their targets. And the Fenians just, there's no way that they could have gotten across at 300 yards, even if they'd formed up for a charge. They may have, if they'd been seasoned troops, if they really had, if they were the veterans of Ridgeway, they may have been able to, but not at Eccles Hill.
Quickly emptying their chambers of brass and thumbing in fresh cartridges, the red sashes and men of the 60th raced to fire again. As the Fenians found cover, they moved to return fire, which they did. The unfamiliar Needham rifles were new to them, and there certainly must have been some degree of fumbling and fussing in their reloading. Up on Eccles Hill, the Sniders of the militia and the Ballards of the red sashes kept up a brisk fire as Fenians presented themselves. The positions selected by Westover and developed by Smith and Chamberlain completely dominated the border area. The Fenian advance guard was trapped. It couldn't move forward, and it couldn't retire. Pinned by the brisk and timely fire of the Canadians, their fire gradually waned. As the Fenians had launched their attack, John O'Neill decided to command his forces from a vantage point on the American side. He selected a large farmhouse overlooking the creek. This was indeed the Rickards house. It would seem that his arrival was not wholly appreciated, however. As his advance guard melted away before his eyes from what can only be the somewhat unexpected and completely devastating musketry of the Canadians, fire too began to rage across the border into the area of the Rickards farm. Alva Rickard, his farm overrun by Fenians, his house occupied by a Fenian general, and dozens of ridiculous spectators cast all over his lumber piles and fences who were now running for their lives back towards Franklin, had enough. He confronted O'Neill and caused the Irishman to vacate his premises. Chastised, and now in command of a battle that was not proving to be as successful as anticipated, O'Neill, as he moved about the buildings, was apprehended by a U.S. Marshal by the name of Foster. The Marshal arrested O'Neill on the spot and took him into custody. Thus, within 30 minutes of launching the attack, the Fenians had lost their commander. Fenians of the main body, in and about Rickard's farm, returned fire as they could. It was in this area where Fenian William O'Brien was shot and killed.
the quality of the Fenian recruit wasn't what it was. Whereas in 1866, many of them were Civil War veterans. By 1870, the vast majority were not. So most of these men had little to no military training at all. Probably many of them had never fired a gun. Certainly they never fired a needle. So that would have only compounded all of the problems that O'Neill was facing.
Although they're not killing a lot of Fenians, they only killed 2 of them, but they're wounding enough of them, forces the Fenians down. Now, the Fenians return fire. But what's interesting is, how do you return fire against basically a wooded hill in the distance and expect to do anything? And you know that this volume of fire from the Canadians, as more reinforcements come in, just gets more and more and more. And the Fenians are replying, but it keeps diminishing. And they're not running out of ammunition. They've got plenty of ammunition. If they need, if it was a case of needing ammo, they've got plenty of ammo. But one can only imagine that, number one, the Needhams are jamming. And once it jams, there's no hold open on that swinging breech block to hold it open like a trapdoor. If you have a trapdoor and you get a jam and you need to put your cleaning rod down in it, knock it out, it'll hold open. A Snider will just swing over to the side if you need to clear a case out of that. A Needham, you hold it up like that and it keeps getting in the way. So basically it takes 2 men to clear the jam on a Needham. And the idea is that probably the Needhams just kept failing. And after several hours of just being under this galling fire, the Fenians, it's getting towards evening, they just give up.
The Fenian position was now fragmented, and all momentum of the attack was lost. Another of the Fenian leadership, General Lewis, was observed amongst the lumber piles of Rickard's farm, shooting his rifle. It is unsure if he was actually commanding men to do the same, or merely acting in isolation. Regardless, the smoke from his rifle began to collect, and thus he was the recipient of a spirited fire put to him by a number of Canadians. He was then observed to have stripped off his uniform and abandoned his weapons, including his sword, to crawl on his belly such distance as to enable him to then run for his life. With these fine examples of leadership, it's no wonder that Fenian efforts did not amount to much in that first hour of battle. Colonel Chamberlain had led a stoic defense, the position intact and the fire effective. The action had been ongoing for about an hour, with desultory firing coming from the Fenians left at the border, and as time wore on, only targets of opportunity were engaged. Sometime near 1:30, Colonel Osborne Smith, who had been turned around when the action began, arrived and took command from Colonel Chamberlain. Smith was a veteran of the Crimea and an experienced soldier of the British Army's 39th Foot. Now, as a lieutenant colonel in the Canadian militia, his influence on the remainder of the battle must have been reassuring. One of the greatest concerns after an hour of fighting was the supply of ammunition.
They kind of infer that they fired a lot of rounds, but again, I think from the Canadian side is more of the Irish were a bunch of cowards, and all we had to do is put a few well-placed shots into them, which really wasn't the case. I mean, I think that the lead was coming down fast and furious on the Richards farm.
An assessment was made, and ammunition on the position was found to indeed be low. Colonel Smith immediately sent parties to Frelighsburg for more Snider ammunition, and to both the Westover and Tenike farms, where a reserve of 1,000 Ballard rounds was held at each. It was perhaps an oversight, lost in the hasty deployment to the border, but was now in the process of being rectified.
The initial Canadian volleys, fired from the Home Guard's Ballards and the militia's Sniders, had stopped the attack dead in its tracks. Despite the shock of first contact, morale must have been high on the Canadian side as the strength of their position became obvious. As the afternoon wore on, more men were on their way. It wasn't over yet.
It's not until around 3:30 in the afternoon that the initial elements of the 3rd Battalion and the 1st Troop Montreal Cavalry arrive on the field. And during this same time period, one company of the 52nd Battalion, which had been concentrating in Frillisburg, arrive on the field. By this point, the fighting has pretty much died down. There's still the odd sporadic shot being fired because, of course, there are still a small group of Fenians who are sort of trapped on our side of the border amongst the buildings. They're down around Reichard's farmhouse and all that. But essentially what's done is the most senior officer on the field, who I believe at that point would have been Lieutenant Colonel Chamberlain, essentially tells the commander of the company of the 52nd, look, we don't need you. You go back to Frillisburg, where your battalion is concentrating, because you're of more value there, has a larger, more cohesive battalion if we need you, than your 40 or 50 men are who have just arrived here. And at the same time, or during that same general time period, 3 to 4 p.m., that's when the lead elements from Montreal arrive. Generally speaking, most of the accounts say that a single company of the 3rd Battalion Victoria Rifles arrive with the 1st Troop Montreal Cavalry.
The Fenians by this time were seemingly spent, and only sporadic firing and certainly no forward movement was attempted. This state of affairs lasted until near 5 o'clock in the afternoon, with the Fenians scattered and broken on both sides of the border, and the Canadian position secure as ever, maintaining its vigilance and engaging when targets presented themselves.
Whereas the Montreal Cavalry has decided, since they're a mounted force, and since there still is concern about the right flank and the crossing of Pigeon Hill, they're ordered to screen off toward the right flank in case the Fenians attempt a second attack and attempt a flanking maneuver or maybe a two-prong attack at Eccles Hill and Pigeons Hill, depending on what may have happened. In reality, none of that materialized.
Still wary of his right flank, he dispatched his mounted men to further augment those of the 60th who had formed the picket on the right flank. The Montreal Cavalry would screen the Pigeon Hill area in more detail. The riflemen of the Victoria Rifles were immediately sent into the line to reinforce the right flank, further bolstering the positions of the Missisquoi Home Guard. The strength of the position can be illustrated by the deployment of the Victoria Rifles. The eastern spur, forming the backbone of the blocking position, provided excellent cover from which the riflemen deployed. Filing in behind the 60th men, these folds and undulations on the slopes of Eccles Hill enabled them to quickly and securely take up positions, more than likely co-locating with some of the red sashes. At 3 o'clock, the first signs of defeat were showing from the Fenian side. Up went a flag of truce, and in the subsequent parley, General Donnelly, now in command of the Fenians, asked for a truce to remove the dead and the wounded. Stone-faced, Smith sent his reply. No such courtesy would be extended to mere marauders. General Donnelly withdrew after exchanging some colorful language with some of the Missisquoi Home Guard, who had approached the border area to receive his parley. Incidentally, during this short ceasefire, as the story goes, Mrs. Eccles, who had been sheltering in their house all this time, sallied out of doors and picked up Rowe's rifle from where he had dropped it when he was hit in the initial engagement. Its whereabouts are unknown. At about 5 in the afternoon, with the battle now having entered somewhat of a stalemate, Asa Westover looked upon this period as an opportunity for his men to withdraw and gain some food and rest. They had, after all, been in the position since the morning of the 24th and had spent the night with only what they had carried. Both Smith and Chamberlain, realizing that the battle was not yet over, implored the red sashes to stay. Relenting, they did for a time, but as the next couple of hours passed with continued inaction, Westover and a large contingent quit the field to replenish and refit. He did, however, leave behind some who volunteered to stay, perhaps a dozen or 20 men. At 5:45, a scout approached and brought the news that the Fenians had a field piece, and that they were in the process of deploying it in the vicinity of Rickard's Hill. Colonel Smith scanned the area with his telescope and spied it, some 1,200 yards distance on the road, being brought forward. The men of the Red Sashes and the 60th, now reinforced by more of their own, along with formed subunits of the 3rd Battalion Victoria Rifles and a troop of the Montreal Cavalry, had stood all afternoon over an ever-decreasing group of what were by now completely demoralized and increasingly frantic Fenians, trapped amongst the houses and outbuildings of the Eccles farm and their neighbors. As afternoon turned into evening, Fenian resistance evaporated. The final act was about to play out. Light was fading when Smith decided that enough was enough. The standoff had lasted all afternoon and into the evening, and many of the Fenians had melted away in ones and twos from the border area and Rickard's farm. Now it was time to clear their front before dark. Shortly after 7 o'clock, Smith organized his attack. The men of the 60th in their current positions between the road and Eccles Hill would form the main effort, with the remnants of the Red Sashes now redeployed to their left. The Victoria Rifles, now ensconced on the right flank, would provide cover. Under the Sniders of the Victorias, the men of the 60th and Red Sashes shook out in extended order and advanced towards the Chickabiddy. Practically no active response was delivered from the Fenians still hiding amongst the buildings, structures, and creek bed. Only about a dozen or so shots were fired, and none of them found their mark. As the skirmish line advanced, first one, then two, then a deluge of men began to scatter, running for their lives. The Fenians threw down their arms and equipment and pulled off their green jackets as they fled pell-mell back into Vermont and to the closest woods and cover they could find. It didn't take long to achieve the expulsion of the invaders, and the Red Sashes and militiamen paused at their border, secure in the knowledge that they had defeated their foe. As nightfall approached, the distinct report of a cannon shot was heard from the woods on Rickard's Hill. The Fenians had shown one last act of defiance in their defeat and fired their field piece.
Fire!
Only some 3 rounds were fired before they withdrew and eventually abandoned the gun nearby. As darkness set in, so victory was gained at Eccles Hill.
In the hours and days that followed the battle, tensions gradually began to fade. Although extreme vigilance and attention was maintained, initially for fear of a renewed Fenian attack, as time passed it became clear that they were not coming on again. The spirited defense of their homes and families put up by the Missisquoi men and their comrades from neighboring counties and from Montreal had seen the last of the Irishmen.
Eccles Hill had been a victory. While not perhaps a sweeping military clash of epic proportions, it was to prove decisive in the context of the 1870 invasions. The night of the 25th and the morning of the 26th was spent in preparation of more Fenian attacks. Pickets at Eccles Hill and presumably elsewhere along the border were kept up. The dead Fenian Rowe was recovered from where he lay on the road, and, after a posed picture, complete with Canadian Snider, as his rifle was nowhere to be found, was taken back up the road where he was buried on the slopes of Eccles Hill. Some enterprising men of the Red Sashes struck out across the border, and, by a circuitous route, approached the Fenian camp. There they found huge caches of stores, weapons and equipment, food and other supplies. They also found the Fenian gun abandoned on its carriage.
They went across the border after dark and dragged that cannon back into Canada so it couldn't be used again the next day. And the Victoria Rifles wanted to take the captured cannon back to Montreal, but Westover wouldn't let them take it.
During the night, lanterns could be seen moving about the battlefield as people began attending to the dead and the wounded. Smith and Chamberlain could count themselves lucky. Not a single casualty had been incurred in any of the militia units engaged, nor in the Red Sashes. The Fenians, perhaps due to their more exposed circumstances, had suffered 2 dead and up to 20 or more wounded. Rowe had been shot at the Chickabiddy, while O'Brien had been killed at Rickard's farm. There are reports that indicate many Fenians were wounded during the final attack made by the militia and red sashes just before nightfall. In their static positions, the Victoria Rifles made good their added musketry on the fleeing Fenians. The campsite to the rear of Eccles Hill became, in the hours and days after, not only the main encampment for the area, but also the repository of all manner of Fenian loot, taken from the Fenian camp and the battlefield itself. In the morning of the 26th, the Missisquoi Home Guard returned after a well-deserved respite. This was because tensions were still high, and news of another expected attack was received. Bringing reinforcements to bear, the 52nd Brome Battalion, some 250 men, were dispatched early in the morning from their muster point in Frellisburg. They arrived at Eccles Hill just before dawn. This proved, however, to be a false alarm. The climax of battle on the 25th was followed by a gradual easing of tensions, but not before yet more reinforcement arrived. The camp became a busy hub of routine military activity, as at various times over the next week it hosted the 52nd Battalion, the remainder of the 60th Battalion, the company of the Victoria Rifles, now joined by their green-clad comrades of the 1st Prince of Wales Rifles, and the troop of Montreal Cavalry. While the threat of renewed Fenian attack did not disappear immediately, within a few days it became apparent that Fenian activity on the Missisquoi frontier was at an end. On the 30th of May, the camp received a visit from a group of dignitaries, including Prince Arthur, son of Queen Victoria, and later, as the Duke of Connaught, the Governor-General of Canada, who was an officer serving with the 1st Battalion, the Rifle Brigade in Montreal. He was serving on the staff at the time, and thus accompanied the other senior officers of the militia and the British Army, who had come to Eccles Hill to address its defenders. General Lindsay, commander of British forces in Canada, addressed those present, which included, by special insistence, men of the Red Sashes and their leader, Asa Westover. He gave a resounding speech, which heaped praise upon all participants, and singled out the Red Sashes in particular. It was a fitting end to a markedly successful operation, but it hadn't been the only one. In his closing remarks, General Lindsay drew everyone's attention to another action, fought 3 days previous. On the 27th of May, a mixed force of Canadian militia and British regulars attacked a Fenian position on the Huntington frontier, west of Lake Champlain.
At the same time that the Fenians were massing from St. Albans up to Franklin to go on Eccles Hill, they're also massing at Malone, New York, which had also been a point of Fenian agitation in 1866. And O'Neill had already sent several thousand of the Needhams up to Malone. And by the time Eccles Hill's over, they've got 3,000 to 4,000 Fenians up there at Malone, and they start moving up about 12 miles north and just short of the border, a little village called Trout River, along the Trout River. They established a camp. Again, they got boxes and boxes and boxes of gear to hand out, but no guns. Now, the reason they don't have any guns is because Colonel Henry LeCarron, actually Thomas Beach, an English spy, when the Fenian general, who was their General Spears, he arrives and he says, "Well, where's the guns?" And Caron says, "Guns? What guns? I don't know about any guns." And he won't divulge and claims to have no knowledge of where the guns are hidden. And Spears just basically gives up at this point. And then Owen Starr, Colonel Owen Starr, who had been O'Neill's right-hand man at Ridgeway, he comes in and he said, you know, everything is a mess at Eccles Hill, and a lot of the Fenians that had been at Eccles Hill, trying to get into the battle, have taken a train and gone across. And it's no short distance getting across. There's a big lake in between you there too, to get out to Malone. And it says, we want to go across. Well, Lynch somehow finds the guns.
Finally, with their weapons found and in hand, Starr launched his attack. Small parties were sent into Canada to cut telegraph wires and other harassing actions, and the main body marched across the border. The spirit of the Irishmen seemingly affected their will for action, and they stopped alongside the Trout River and dug in. Erecting barricades across the road and rudimentary earthworks anchored on the river, the Fenians proved content with their tiny foothold only a half-mile into Canada. Mobilized and sent by train, and thence on foot, a mixed brigade of militia and British regulars deployed to attack. Militiamen of the 50th Battalion, the Huntington Borderers, some 250 strong, formed the skirmish line in extended order, while Her Majesty's 69th Foot, some 450 strong, formed in quarter column behind. The 50th men advanced and engaged the Fenians behind their barricades, followed by the 69th in support. The attack was a complete success, and as the Canadian skirmishers approached, the Fenians melted away, back across the border. It would seem that as a result of that attack, the Fenians had been soundly defeated at every turn.
Although not particularly well known across modern Canada, the Fenian raids culminating in the 1870 incursions left a huge impact upon the local families and communities across the eastern townships. Incredibly, the Fenians would try one more time, the very next year, crossing the border into the new province of Manitoba. This effort also came to naught. For the country of Canada, the threat of Irish invasion was finally over.
Well, after the real fizzle, if you could call it that, of the 1871 raid out at Pembina into Manitoba along the Red River, the whole Fenian movement just kind of implodes. They're still around and they're all fighting amongst each other. At the same time, the British government releases some of its long-term Fenian prisoners, and with the promise that they'll leave and never come back to Ireland again. And so a group of them come to the U.S. and they try their best to try and unite all these factions, and they can't do it. And this goes on for nearly 20 years. And eventually, it comes down to an organization called Clan na Gael, which means our family of Gaels. And they went, just like the Irish Republican Brotherhood, they went underground. And they're very secret. And their point is, we know going to Canada again is not, this isn't working. And so we'll raise money to support efforts in Ireland and against Britain, the dynamite bombings and so forth, the 1880s and 1890s. And they become really the fundraiser for the funds to buy arms and so forth for the Irish Republican Brotherhood in Ireland. And they're the ones who really give their support to the Easter Rising of 1916. And although the Easter Rising certainly was a failure militarily, I think in a historical sense, we all know that was the genesis of the War of Independence, where Ireland finally gained its free state status and later became an independent republic. I think today, though, and especially since the Good Friday Accords, finally putting an end to the troubles in Northern Ireland, that really it's more of a cultural, music, language, literary sort of support, and not the support for any kind of military action.
I think we could say that the raids of 1866 were the defining factor for the Canadian militia, both in the local context in the townships and across Canada, for at least the next 20, 25 years, if not right up until the South African War. In the sense that it caused a transformation within the militia. Not to mention it also, reinforced Confederation and reinforced the fact that we as a nation could no longer rely solely on the British Army and the Royal Navy for our defense. And this is where we see a large transformation in the militia, better arms. The Snider, some of the first troops to get issued the Snider are the Canadian militia. Organizing of more battalions, less independent companies, more artillery, more mounted troops, a more centralized command structure. And this all leads into the success that we had in 1870. The success that probably is built quite a bit off of the Fenians, the Fenians' lack of planning and bad luck and everything else it might have come to, but nevertheless, a success. But post 1870, the lessons that were learned, and I'd probably very much like we see it throughout Canadian military history, get quickly forgotten. Of course, for the militia, locally speaking, 1866 was a huge recruitment boost. Because of course, particularly for people who lived in the border areas, of course, they either directly experienced the raids of 1866, or at the very least, they sort of experienced the fear of it. So this leads to a lot of recruitment, a lot of interest, a lot of training goes on, things like this happen. After the raids of 1870, and you see this when you look at the actual pay lists for the militia, recruitment declines. It becomes harder and harder for battalions to maintain senior NCOs and officers. And it continues to decline at this rate slowly. And I'm talking in the local context for the local rural battalions. It declines like this continuously until the 1890s, so much so that by 1897, the 60th Battalion is on the verge of disappearing. For the simple fact that other than, getting a 2-week paid holiday every summer where you can go with your buddies and drink in militia camp, there's not a whole lot of interest in the militia beyond that. And we see that for most of the local militia units, with the exception of our one urban battalion in Sherbrooke. Just a dwindling interest generally. And of course, post 1870, we're not being re-equipped with Martini Henrys. We're not, the majority of the militia are making do with even less equipment by 1880 than they had in 1870. And this just continues on. Of course, the Northwest Rebellion changes things a little bit, less so in Quebec, maybe more so in Ontario, because there's suddenly a need, there's a situation in Saskatchewan and Manitoba that needs to be dealt with. But even that subsides rather quickly. And really the militia by the 1890s is outside of the urban setting in Quebec is a dwindling organization. The system was different back then, but if a battalion failed to account for itself at summer camp, then the battalion was essentially struck from service. And that's essentially what happened to the 60th. They dwindled to the point where what few men remained simply could no longer hold the organization together, and they essentially disappeared off the map. Of course, the Victoria Rifles, the 3rd Battalion Victoria Rifles, went on to become the Victoria Rifles, and of course they disappeared. And during the big shuffle in the 1960s, when the Canadian Army was the number of regiments in the Canadian Army was greatly reduced. So the only actual unit to hold an official battle honor from Eccles Hill disappeared in the 1960s. And that really was the last tangible link to Eccles Hill. To a lesser degree, there are the Royal Canadian Hussars, who perpetuate, among other units, the 1st Troop Montreal Cavalry, which never had a battle honor, of course, for Eccles Hill, but did have some level of participation in that event. And of course, the Royal Canadian Hussars exist today, of course. And that's probably the closest thing to a tangible link you will find today. But beyond that, it's, and when we talk about the question of the battle honors as well, that's a rather interesting thing in the sense that the 3rd Battalion, they received the battle honor December 5th, 1879 is when the battle honor was officially authorized for Eccles Hill. and they are the only unit to hold it. But on the other hand, by August 1870, the 60th Battalion had asked militia headquarters for permission to bear the words Eccles Hill on their regimental color, and the permission was granted, but they were never granted the actual battle honor. And I suspect that probably comes back to the fact that the 3rd Battalion was a probably more politically connected battalion than the 60th was. And when someone finally got the idea that we should issue a battle honor for that, because that's one we actually won, they're the ones that have the political clout to make sure it happened. Because in reality, there are only 2 battle honors issued for the Fenian raids: Trout River and Eccles Hill. Specifically, we're dealing with the Canadian General Service Medal, which was awarded for service in the Fenian raids of 1866, the Fenian raids of 1870, as well as the Red River Rebellion of 1870. So technically, it's Canada's first service medal.
You have to remember the medals weren't issued until about 1900, 1899, 1900. They were trying to recruit people for the Boer War, so they're kind of showing off these nice shiny medals. This is what you can get if you go fight against the Boers.
You had to have served during the period in an area threatened, and that's a very broad term, in order to qualify. And you needed to be a living recipient, and you needed to formally apply for the medal in order to receive it. So this means, since we're dealing with 30 plus years after the events, of course, many of the men, both Canadian and British, because both members of the British Army and the Royal Navy also received the medals, had to be alive, be aware of it, and apply to the appropriate authorities, whether it be here in Canada or to the medal office in Britain, in order to receive the medal. Like most medals of the period, and to a certain degree even today, and you won't see this in the Zoom video, we'll insert the appropriate image later, but of course they're always named on the rim. And this is something which has been an ongoing thing with British and to a certain degree Canadian service medals to this day. This particular medal, I'll hold it up again, is particularly special because it is named to a member of the Missisquoi Home Guard. In this case, it is named to a private, which is probably more of an honorific rank, considering he was not a member of an authorized militia force. W.R. Gilson, Missisquoi Home Guard. To my knowledge, this is the only time in Canadian history that a civilian-raised, organized, non-sanctioned, and self-armed militia force was formally recognized with military service medals. On the obverse, it's actually Queen Victoria, but it's interesting that it's the effigy of Queen Victoria that would have been commonly used on service medals from the late 1890s and up until their death, because that just goes to show how many years after the events the medal was actually issued. On the reverse, the words Canada, with a very old version of the Canadian red ensign, surrounded by sort of a wreath of maple leaves. So definitely a very Canadian medal.
People that know about it are very proud of it. There are families that are very, very proud of their ancestors that fought in the Fenian raids. A lot of people in Quebec, a lot of English people have moved out of Quebec. Families it used to be all English, but now it's probably 50% French. So you have families that know nothing about what happened. So it's a little bit of an odd story. It's news to a lot of people. Most people say, I never heard of that. And when they do hear about it, they're really enthralled with it. They're amazed at what happened. But in general, a lot of people don't know much about it. It's unfortunate that we lose our history because there was so little written about it in the history books. I had my father's history book. I wish I could find it. It's back in 1920 something, and there were like 2 lines about the Fenian raids in that book. It hasn't been advertised.
Commemoration and memorializing of the events of 1866 and 1870 on the Missisquoi frontier lie with the monument erected in 1902 at Eccles Hill. Placed just behind the eastern spur, next to the road to the border, it stands as the only major significant monument on the battlefield. The captured Fenian gun is also there, mounted on a block of concrete. Nearby are examples of the large rocks that litter the slopes, and through the trees more can be seen down towards the border, marking the positions taken up by the men of the 60th Battalion. There have been local events and ceremonies marking the anniversary. The most recent at the time of publication was in 2022. While minor in scope, it was an important effort. In the past, there have been somewhat more involved efforts to commemorate the action. In 1959, there was a large event held including a mock battle. Film exists of this event and is on the Franklin, Vermont Historical Society YouTube channel. Down the road, sometimes hardly visible due to the undergrowth, is a small cairn to Margaret Vincent, who was killed in 1866 accidentally by British troops posted nearby as she was getting water from a well. Today, the memory of Eccles Hill lies with enthusiasts and local historians. Perhaps one day, more formal, official, and significant remembrance can take place. It's also important to note that the Fenian raids, as they became known, were the focal point for remembrance of Canada's military efforts and those who were lost in the service of their country. The 2nd of June, the anniversary of the Battle of Ridgeway, became Canada's Decoration Day and was the primary military memorial event until Armistice Day, now of course Remembrance Day, was adopted across the Empire in 1919 as November 11th. This brings us to the end of Part 3 of the Eccles Hill series. In Part 4, the historical supplement, there will be continued discussion of my trip to the townships, further examination of the Needham's impact on the battle, details of the Fenian cannon captured at Eccles Hill, and importantly, the whole foundation of this project, the set of historical shooting experiments conducted by Branco and I. I will be forever indebted to the members of the Eccles Hill team, Ken, Ross, Lorne, and Branco. Without them, this lengthy and hopefully interesting project would never have got off the ground. In addition, Jean Plamondon, a friend of Ross's, helped a great deal by bringing his Fenian kit along and adding a touch of green to the project. He is also the proprietor of P&S Militaria in Quebec. If you'd like to view British muzzleloaders and many other channels in an ad-free environment, free from the content restraints of YouTube and other platforms, then I might suggest you head on over to History of Weapons and War, where you can subscribe and find this channel and many like it, presented as they should be, all in one place. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well.